Professor Martin is assistant professor in the program of liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame, where she received a PhD in 2012. She's a systematic theologian with areas of research interest in 19th and 20th century Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox thought. She has 3 children, not yet 5. She has 3, and she has 1 dog, which she tells me is very poorly behaved, but it cannot be attributed to the dog's stupidity. He is a smart but stupid dog. Now, if you can help me in giving Professor Martin a hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all, and thank you so much. I'm happy to be here with the esteemed physicist and my friend Steve Barr as well. And so basically, I'd like to talk to you today about the nature of creation and theologies of beauty and creativity. So basically what I'd like to accomplish in this discussion this morning is to provide a kind of conceptual vocabulary for you, drawing on developments in the philosophical and the theological tradition in the Western intellectual tradition and aesthetics. And so when I do say aesthetics, let's go ahead and define some terms here because this may be unfamiliar to some of you. When I say aesthetics, I mean the part of philosophy that studies the phenomena of beauty and the beautiful, especially as applied to the fine arts. It often prioritizes the subjective, emotional, and intellectual experience of beauty. When I say theological aesthetics, this is a kind of a subdiscipline of aesthetics. It's kind of adjacent to philosophical aesthetics. It engages with the questions of beauty, culture, and the arts and creativity through the lens of more theological categories, like the doctrine of God as Trinity, the nature of revelation, which you know from your religion classes, how God reveals God's self to human beings, and Christology and pneumatology, the study of the Holy Spirit. So theological aesthetics is probably pretty universally connected with this scholar, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who was born in 1905 and died in 1988. He gives really the most thorough account of theological aesthetics in the contemporary theological world. He spent his whole career arguing that beauty needs to be recovered as what's called a transcendental. Now, transcendentals are things like truth, goodness, and Balthasar was arguing that beauty ought to be connected with beauty and goodness as well as truth, with the same kind of ontological status. He also argued that the work of theology really needed to be done in a compelling and beautiful way. So he argued for theology not to be just kind of propositions about God, information about God, but he argued for the inclusion of poetry and literature and art and culture in theological discourse. Now, on the very, very first page of his very actually daunting Theological Aesthetics, which is 7 volumes at 400 pages a pop, he says these kind of fighting words, I think. He says, "Beauty is the word which shall be our first. We no longer dare to believe in beauty, and we make of it a mere appearance in order the more easily to dispose of it. We can be sure that whoever sneers at her name can no longer pray, and soon will no longer be able to love." These are really strong words and interesting words. What do you think he could mean by saying that an appreciation of beauty is somehow required for prayer and for love? Surely he's got to assume in this statement that beauty is not simply something that's merely in the eye of the beholder, as the cliche goes. Now, of course, the topic of beauty is very complicated and it's very difficult. It's been the subject of a lot of inquiries since ancient Greece, all the way up into our own time. I won't, of course, be able to give you a comprehensive narrative today about the way that beauty has been thought about in philosophy and theology, but I want to address the following few aspects of this conversation, and we can open up the conversation a bit more in the question and answer period. The first question I'd like to address is whether we should think about beauty as subjective or objective. That is, are our judgments about beautiful things or objects or people anything more than indications of our own personal preference, just what you happen to prefer? And a related question is, can one thing actually be more beautiful than another, if it's just a matter of opinion? The second question that I'd like us to consider today is the long connection of beauty to desire, what it is that we truly, really want at bottom. Our desire for the transcendent, for God, and what this relationship of beauty and desire really might tell us about who God is, and also about who we are in our own truest and deepest selves. The third thing I'd like to address is the phenomenon of creativity and how the impulse that we all have toward creative work might have something also to say about who God is and who we are as created in the image and likeness of God. So let's start with this long contested question of whether beauty is subjective, that is, only in the eye of the beholder, just your opinion, or objective, that is, it has some kind of property in the object itself that you're looking at that's reliable and that's objective. So this phrase that we've heard a million times, beauty is only in the eye of the beholder, it's been repeated mindlessly enough to sort of have the air of truth about it, but I want to push on that a little bit. Certainly it's true that people do have different tastes, right? In art, in fashion, in the attractiveness of their romantic partners. There's also what we might call the Velveteen Rabbit phenomenon. Anybody read this book? Or the parents may have. It's an old classic from 1922. And if you don't know this story, it's a very kind of charming children's story from 1922 about how toys become real, right? So it seems like in the Velveteen Rabbit, anything that by any objective standard would be beautiful or would be ugly is in fact really very dear and beautiful to us because we love it and because it awakens in us a kind of tenderness or nostalgia. So we'll take a look at a passage from this children's book. So at first, when the Velveteen Rabbit first shows up on the scene, as the author describes him, he's fat and bunchy as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white. He had real thread whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink sateen. But then he has this conversation that's reproduced on the slide with a much older toy, the Skin Horse, who was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hairs in his tail had been pulled out. The exchange between them goes like this. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day when they are lying side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you were made," said the Skin Horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the Skin Horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked, "or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the Skin Horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily or have sharp edges, who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand." We could also point to the very well-documented fact that in different times and in different cultures, people have had very different aesthetic values in art, architecture, and even personal attractiveness and beauty or cosmetic standards, which this philosopher Umberto Eco has described in this encyclopedia called The History of Beauty that came out in 2004. So his pop culture references are kind of dated. I think they crest with George Clooney, and then that's kind of the end. But he gives these timelines of beautiful people, all the way from the Paleolithic figurine of the Venus of Willendorf, who's portrayed here from 30,000 BCE, and Botticelli's Birth of Venus, all the way up through contemporary movie stars and supermodels. We also know, or can at least recognize, that cultures like ancient Greece prioritized symmetry, order, mathematical proportion, and a very strict kind of harmony between parts and wholes, like in the Parthenon, for instance, or the canon of Polykleitos, who sculpted the human form with mathematically ideal proportions. And then we know that more modern art, post-figural developments in art, were more interested, like this Kandinsky or the Rothko that are reproduced here, highlighting fields of color and shape and line and the textures of paint. You can sort of touch and see the brushstrokes of the paint, right? So you have different values in fine art that shifts through cultures. Now, our friend Balthazar has acknowledged that beauty really can manifest itself in different art forms. For instance, in the first volume of his book, The Theologic, he gives this pretty dense quote, which I'll read, and it's reproduced for you in this slide. He writes, "Beauty can enter into every partial aspect and element, even into those apparently contrary to one another. For this reason, beauty can seem, from one point of view, to consist entirely in measure, in proportion, in delimited form, as if the image, understood as the appearance of the essence, were its true home. But in the twinkling of an eye, beauty can also appear to consist essentially in movement, in the rhythm of communication itself, or in the eternal movement of yearning for what lies beyond all delimited forms and images. At one moment, it can look like perfect formality, like the Greek Parthenon that we were looking at, and others like sheer formlessness, maybe more like Frankenthaler's Canyon that's reproduced here as a piece of modern art. But in both modes of appearance are in reality only manifestations of the same mysterious ground of beauty." Now, this very long and dense quote from Balthazar suggests very clearly that the mystery of beauty can appear both in the formalism of classical art and in non-representational, more self-consciously painterly work like abstract expressionism, like Frankenthaler or the Kandinsky or the Rothko from the slide before. So someone may say, well, it's the case, however, that beautiful phenomenon do seem to share some objective general features. We can turn here to St. Thomas Aquinas. In the prima pars of his long Summa Theologica, in question 39, Aquinas points out three fundamental conditions of beauty. Integritas, which is a sense of wholeness or perfection. Consonatia, proportionality or harmony between parts, unity and diversity. And claritas, a kind of radiance, luminosity, clarity, or brightness. Now here it's important to know that Thomas Aquinas, in this context of question 39, is not laying out an aesthetic theory. He's really actually talking about the Trinity here and how the relations of the persons of the Trinity work together. But it is kind of significant, I think, for thinking a little more deeply about the nature of the beautiful. And we could probably add to Thomas Aquinas' list, right? Think about some elements that are present in a beautiful thing, whether that thing is something in art or something in nature. Symmetry, simplicity, fluidity, or a really evocative use of color and line. But the problem with this, with making a list of this is what constitutes something beautiful, is that you can find exceptions to the rule pretty quickly. And you can also think, well, someone could make a piece of art that's perfectly mathematically proportionate, but it's flat, it still doesn't work, it's still not beautiful. And so thinking about some of those exceptions, there's a text in 1757 by Edmund Burke called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Beautiful and the Sublime. And so he wonders about whether proportion can actually be a reliable predictor of beauty. And so he talks about, what about swans or peacocks or little rosebuds on a big bush? So sometimes things can be disproportionate, but also still not be ugly. They can still be beautiful. And there's also, if we look at other cultures out of the Western line, Japanese aesthetics, we give some really interesting notions in Japanese art and aesthetics that actually don't disguise, but actually really celebrate imperfection and fragility and asymmetry and those kinds of things as themselves being inherently beautiful. The first, I think, is the Japanese idea of what's called wabi-sabi, which is an aesthetic philosophy of finding beauty in imperfection, asymmetry, flaws, anomalies, aging, incompleteness, disrepair. And so it's a very interesting aesthetic philosophy. And then there's a kind of subset of wabi-sabi, which is this Japanese technique you may have seen called kintsugi, which is takes a broken piece of pottery, and instead of fixing it and concealing the scars, it highlights the breakages. It fills the scars with gold or silver lacquer. So it's interesting that it highlights the trauma and the scars of the broken piece of pottery, right? So we're kind of in the middle here. Is beauty purely objective? Well, no. Is beauty purely subjective? No, also. It seems that the experience of beauty for sure cannot be purely objective. That is, with features in the object which present and are sort of automatically beautiful. And also think about beauty is always going to be experienced by human subjects, right? We receive beauty, and so it has to have some element of subjectivity. But I think we really ought to also highlight how important it is to think that beauty and the experience of beauty is not relativistic, right? I want to make a sort of separation between saying that beauty can be subjective without being radically relative. We can think about some reasons for saying this. First of all, in the very long philosophical tradition of aesthetics, beauty has really long been considered to possess a kind of objectivity and depth, and those associations I mentioned at the beginning with goodness and with truth. I mean, the idea that we all probably have in a sort of unexamined way is that beauty really is purely subjective or purely relativistic or purely your opinion. But this is really a modern invention in philosophical aesthetics, right? This doesn't show up until the 18th century with figures like Immanuel Kant or David Hume. We also have this question of consensus, right? So most people think and have thought that pieces of art like the Mona Lisa or the Birth of Venus or a piece by Mozart or the Iliad, any of these kind of classic texts or pieces of art are beautiful. And so this kind of consensus is precisely what makes it possible to have things called classics in literature or music or art. So some art, is preserved very carefully in the Guggenheim or the MoMA or the Vatican Museum. And some art, like all of my children's art, for instance, is sort of haphazardly thumbtacked to bulletin boards and spattered with spaghetti sauce or shoved in a drawer. So what kind of accounts for this difference, right? If beauty is only kind of in the eye of the beholder, if the value of art is only in the eye of the beholder. And then, of course, we have to add another wrinkle to this question, which is that some art doesn't aspire at all to be beautiful, right? Some art seeks not to give us aesthetic pleasure, but to provoke or chastise or critique or enrage or stir us to action. And I think all of this art has a place. Not all of this art is necessarily beautiful, nor should we presuppose that all art intends to be beautiful. So let me give you a kind of quick summary of where we are. I think what I hope we have determined at this point is that beauty is neither purely subjective, that is purely constructed or invented or imagined by the person who's seeing a beautiful thing, nor is it purely objective, that is appearing only in predictable features of whatever the beautiful object is, but that the truth of the matter is probably somewhere closer to the middle. So here's my proposal, that beauty and our experience of beauty is a highly cooperative one, relying in part upon the appearance and features of the object, and in part upon the structuring capacity of the person's perception, who sees a beautiful image, not only as one thing among others in a visual field, but in terms of its coherence or mystery or depth. I don't think that the subjective element over-relativizes beauty to where, to quote the dude from The Big Lebowski, which I realize is more for the parents, this movie came out in 1998, which is before many of you were born, that beauty is just like your opinion, man. But objective and subjective elements of the experience of beauty are in different ways really participations in God. And I think this is the premise that I think lends a kind of meta-objectivity to the whole operation, which is a claim that I think we need to unpack. What do I mean by the fact that the experience of beauty can be a cooperation between the objective and the subjective, and both of that is a participation in God, which gives our experience of beauty this sort of air of objectivity? So let's think for a minute, not philosophically, but think about your own experiences of beauty in your life thus far. What does the experience of real, genuine beauty feel like? Like at the level of your body. Think about a time when you saw or heard something really jaw-droppingly, arrestingly gorgeous. I mean, it could be anything, a mountain vista, a movie montage, a really perfectly executed basketball shot by a professional athlete, a face, a painting, a bit of classical music, a hymn, a line of poetry, prose, anything that you saw and registered as beautiful. What does that feel like? I think if my own experiences are not completely singular, these instances of encountering genuine beauty feels, if we're very, very attentive, for a single moment, if we're really paying attention, something that's not very different from pain. A little like something in your chest is caving in, right there, right? It feels like you're kind of getting hit in the chest. Sometimes this feeling of pain, when you see something truly transcendently beautiful, presents as a kind of wistfulness or a longing or a feeling of expansiveness, like your heart's gotten a little too big for your rib cage. My daughter was maybe 4 at the time, and we were driving, and she saw a sunset, and she said, "I like looking at that. It makes my heart feel so big." Right? I thought, like, even her, she knows at the level of the body that there's something about beauty that expands, something about beauty that opens us up, and that kind of hurts. So if we start from what our bodies already seem to know is true, we get close to the premise that I'm after today, that the experience of beauty can reliably, if we're paying attention to ourselves, right, be experienced as this kind of lack or a wound, something like a nostalgia for some unnameable, inarticulable, infinite something that we can't quite name or envision. Now, it turns out that our bodies, if this is true, our bodies are already really good philosophers, whether we know it or not. This association of beauty and this sense of longing or painful longing has a really long history in the Western philosophical tradition. So if we pan all the way back to 385 BC, we get to Plato's famous dialogue called the Symposium. And the Symposium is a set of collected speeches about love and beauty and desire. I think one of the most popular speeches, or one of my favorites at least, is a creative origins myth that's told by a comic poet, Aristophanes, who wrote the comedies, The Frogs, Lysistrata, Clouds, those kinds of things. But what's really interesting to me is when he prefaces his speech, he says, "Don't take this as a joke. I know you're going to be tempted to take this as a joke, but I'm perfectly serious." So he tells this very creative narrative about the origins of romantic desire. He tells us in this myth that human beings were originally spherical, like this picture here, with 2 heads and 4 arms and 4 legs. But because they were misbehaving and Zeus wanted to control their ambition and control their misbehaving, he cut them in two. The text says they were cut in two like you would slice an egg, right in half. And after that happened, they spent the rest of their days in this state of awful longing, wandering around, looking for their other halves, weaving themselves together, the text says, with one after another, unsuccessfully chasing this original perfect union that they had once enjoyed. Aristophanes says that this is the source of our desire to love each other. Love is born into every human being. It calls back the halves of our original nature together. It tries to make one out of two and heal the wound of human nature. What's interesting to me is that even in this text, which is a pre-Christian text, of course, it has Aristophanes, the comic poet, acknowledging that love, this desire for complete wholeness and union, turns out not to be merely a desire for pleasure or for emotional or romantic intimacy, but rather for something really mysterious that they cannot name. The text goes on to say that there are people who finish out their lives together and still cannot say what it is they want from one another. It's obvious that the soul of every lover longs for something else. His soul cannot say what it is, but like an oracle, it has a sense of what it wants, and like an oracle, it hides behind a riddle. End of the quote. So it's no small wonder that all the way since Plato, beauty and this sense of pain have been tangled together. At the end of Aristophanes' speech, he has Hephaestus, the god of metallurgy. Any Percy Jackson fans in the audience? Yeah, okay, good. So Hephaestus shows up with his tools, and he comes to these two people, and he says, what is it that you really want from each other? But this, again, is inarticulable. They are unable to say what it is that they truly want. But then Hephaestus offers to meld them together into a single being, which even after death would have one rather than two souls. They know that it's this radical union. That's precisely what they've been wanting all along, and precisely what they have been unable to achieve. So later in the symposium, we have a different speech. This is one that Socrates reports that's given by this mysterious figure called Diotima. And here is where Diotima tells Socrates that the experience of beauty involves this fundamental desire towards a transcendent reality. Now, of course, this is a pre-Christian text. So in this text, this infinite thing is not God. It's the theory of the forms, which is something you'll get in Philosophy 101 when you get to college. But basically, sort of spoilers, I'll tell you ahead of time. Diotima argues that encountering true beauty is like going up a ladder. It's this kind of gradual ascent to the transcendent. So Diotima says, you get good at seeing a beautiful person. Okay, so you can recognize beauty in a person, one person among others. And that allows you to expand your vision and see beauty in other people. And that allows you to expand your vision further and see the beauty of a soul, a spiritual beauty. And that allows you to see the beauty of law and order and institutions. And you go on and on and on, up the ladder with more and more expansive vision until finally you achieve union with the form of beauty itself, and you leave these kind of concrete experiences of it behind for full participation in the form of beauty. So in Plato, beautiful things, their function is gradually to draw the perceiver out of herself towards something bigger, something more transcendent, something divine. Beauty then will always open out onto the more. It's generative, it's fecund. As a matter of fact, Diotima's speech connects desire, not simply with beauty, but something a little bit more subtle. She says in this conversation, which I'll read, she says, "You see, Socrates, what love wants is not beauty as you think it is. Well, what is it then? reproduction, and birth in beauty. Maybe, I said. He's not impressed so far. Certainly, she said. Now, why reproduction? It's because reproduction goes on forever. It is what mortals have in place of immortality. A lover must desire immortality along with the good, if what we agreed earlier was right, that love wants to possess the good forever. It follows from our argument that love must desire immortality. That is, love wants to make beauty infinite, to go on forever. Okay, so we're getting kind of in the philosophical weeds here. So let's take a step back and think about how that, some implications of what Diotima is saying and how we experience beauty. The first thing is something that a philosopher, Elaine Scarry, has drawn out in a book called On Beauty and Being Just. She says that the experience of true beauty always opens up the desire to reproduce it, to replicate it, right? Think about you're going on a trip and you see a cathedral or you see a sunset or you see anything. What do? The first thing you do, you take out your phone and you take a picture of it, right? You replicate it, you reproduce the thing, or you tell a friend about it, or you write a poem about it, or maybe the sort of most fundamental way of replicating the experience is just staring, right? You see something beautiful and it doesn't just pass through your visual field. You keep it, you look at it, you stare at it, you examine it. That's a way of kind of reproducing the moment of the experience of beauty. And the second kind of implication that I think is important for us to recognize from what Diotima is saying is that every finite instantiation of beauty cannot satisfy what is in truth the desire that we have for beauty as infinite, beauty as transcendent, and as a theologian, I will say beauty as God, right? This is what it is we truly want, which means theologically that every experience of beauty that we have is an invitation for the experience of God, that beautiful things really ought to reflect our attention more profoundly to God. And that also means that those impulses we have to replicate beauty in creativity stems from our glimpsing, even if but a fragile moment, the kind of mysterious unity of all things in God. So let me say, we're not very good at this sometimes, right? We tend not to see things see beautiful things as directing us to God, right? We don't really pay attention. We're scrolling through our phones all the time. We've dulled our senses, right? So let's maybe in the Q&A we can think a little bit together about some strategies for really cultivating this sense of attentiveness to beauty. One of the things I think is important for us to recognize, to jump from Plato into the Catholic theological tradition, is that this idea of beauty directing us to God or being clues to the experience of God shows up quite a lot in the Catholic theological tradition. You know, some of the usual suspects for this are going to be St. Augustine and St. Bonaventure. Those of you who may have read the Confessions will recognize this very famous text from Confessions 10, where Augustine says, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new." And he's addressing God directly, right? "Late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside, and it was there that I searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you. Yet if they had not been in you, they would have not been at all. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more." Right? You see this sense that Augustine is also, that beauty is opening out into the more. We can see it again in St. Bonaventure in his Life of St. Francis, where you can see he's really borrowing very heavily from the symbol of the latter in Diotima's speech in the Symposium, where Bonaventure writes, "In beautiful things, he," that is St. Francis, "saw beauty itself, and through his vestiges imprinted on creation, he followed his beloved everywhere, making from all things a ladder by which he could climb up and embrace him who is utterly desirable." So to put it very clearly, I want to assume the hypothesis today that if not the most reliable characteristic of genuine beauty, is perhaps this affective, emotional, embodied, intellectual, and spiritual response of something like melancholy or longing that it awakens in the viewer towards transcendence and union with God. True beauty, I think, may tell us best that this world is not our home. Of course, the poet Dante has a lot to say about beauty and God. In the Paradiso, he says that God is the end of all desire. He lifts his longing to the ardent limit. So I think we really need to hear the converse of this claim as well, right? That this definition of beauty also implies that those phenomena which cause us to be more selfish, more self-conscious, more inclined to consume rather than to create, more inclined to be closed rather than open, or want to possess rather than to praise, is a beauty that's actually deceptive and counterfeit. I'll go quickly through the next slide here. This is a passage from Dante's Purgatorio where he's been wanting to see his old girlfriend Beatrice this whole time, right? You know the story of the Inferno and the Purgatory and the Paradiso, where Dante goes on this kind of epic quest all the way through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And what pulls him along is Beatrice. And when she shows up, it is not the joyful romantic reunion or really positive reunion at all. She kind of scolds him and says, you know, you didn't, when you saw my beauty, it didn't direct you to God. You followed counterfeits of goodness, which never pay in full what they have promised. So I think what we're seeing here is that the experience of beauty as longing is a major clue to the nature of beauty and to the nature of human beings. I want to say clearly that I think beauty has an infinite source, that is God, and that it is God who we really want. If all our provisional and earthly desires, in fact, have a truly infinite reach, if what we really want is full participation in and union with God, then beauty can really provide reliable but only limited intimations of this full blessedness which is to come. So we can recognize these intimations, but like Aristophanes' lovers who were searching for perfect unity, we cannot say genuinely what it is that we truly want. But here's the thing, these experiences of beauty are absolutely real. And the experience of beauty, even if it presents as a kind of form of contingency, is actually a form of real knowledge with the degree of certainty and objectivity that can pertain to other forms of knowledge. So in the packet you have the full essay from Pope Benedict XVI, this text called The Feeling of Things, the Contemplation of Beauty. He says that being struck and overcome by the beauty of Christ. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure what's happened.
Yeah.
Try to figure it out.
It's just a picture of Ratzinger. I'll go ahead and keep reading. He says that the feeling of being struck and overcome by the beauty of Christ is more real and more profound knowledge than mere rational deduction. Ratzinger doesn't want to discount here the importance of serious theological reflection, but he's really adamant that we can't disdain or reject the impact produced by the response of the heart in encounter with beauty as a true form of knowledge. There he is. I love that picture when he's young. He looks very dangerous, doesn't he? There's also some great pictures of him with his cat in the same kind of era. But anyway, he says what we know here is a true form of knowledge. Now, if you've read this piece before, or you will read it, he tells a story at the end of being in a concert hall and hearing a piece of music by Mozart. And as it comes to its stirring conclusion, he turns to his seatmate and he says, anybody who's heard this knows that the faith is true. It's a kind of odd thing to say, right? You hear a piece of Mozart and you say, anyone who has heard this knows that the faith is true. This music has such an extraordinary force of reality that we realized, he says, no longer by deduction, but by the impact on our hearts that it could not have originated from nothingness, but only have come to be through the power of the truth that became real in the composer's inspiration. So I think what's interesting here is that a knowledge of beauty can be intuitive, can be emotional, can be affective, can be embodied, can be non-deductive, and yet still be objective. And we really need to take this seriously as a form of knowledge and come to trust ourselves to be able to experience that reliably. To conclude, I'll look at this final text, The Letter to Artists by John Paul II, in which he writes that beauty is a key to the mystery and a call to transcendence. It is an invitation to savor life and to dream of the future. That is why the beauty of created things can never fully satisfy. It stirs that hidden nostalgia for God. Pope Benedict XVI has also noted this connection in his text that you have, invoking another Platonic dialogue, the Phaedrus, where the encounter with beauty comes as an emotional shock that serves to attract the one who beholds it to what is other than himself. In the Phaedrus, the human being has lost his original state of perfection and unity, and its beauty and those painful experiences of beauty, which causes him pain and causes him to suffer. Ratzinger goes on to say that we could say the arrow of nostalgia pierces man, wounds him, and in this way gives him wings, lifts him upward toward the transcendent. It is the beauty of God himself who draws us to himself, and at the same time captures us with the wound of love, the holy passion that enables us to go forth together with and in the church, his bride, to meet the love who calls us. All beauty points to when God shall be all in all, yet in this world we must experience it in part as a lack, a nostalgia, a grief. Beauty in its truest sense is thus a gesture to and pointer to our true home, which is ultimate union with God, who is all love and all beauty and the creative source of all love and beauty and all that is real. And when we exercise creativity in whatever form, even if we're not very good artists, as John Paul II puts it, we go beyond what the senses perceive, and reaching beneath reality's surface, strive to interpret the hidden mystery. The intuition itself springs from the depths of the human soul, where the desire to give meaning to one's own life is joined by the fleeting vision of beauty and the mysterious unity of things. Believers find nothing strange in this. They know they have had a momentary glimpse of the abyss of light, which has its original wellspring in God. So I think I'll stop there. I'm so grateful for your attention, and I'm looking forward to talking with you more in the Q&A. So thanks. Definitely, yes. So like in the world of art, for instance, you like the art that I kind of alluded to a little bit. You have art that doesn't try to be beautiful, right? I mean, the most famous example that people give is Marcel Duchamp. He did this piece called Fountain, which is really just a urinal that he took out. He went and bought one and put it on display in a museum. I do not think that is objectively beautiful, but I also think what's interesting about that piece of art, which doesn't awaken that sense of transcendence in me, probably in no one, but what it does do, which I think is interesting, is it takes the sort of artifact out of its kind of commodified use, right? It's a thing you can buy, and what Duchamp does when he gets this is he says, I'm going to sort of take this thing, and with my sort of human agency, I'm going to transform it from just this thing you can buy and use into something like art. So I think actually that moment is something beautiful. There's a guy, Davor Zalto, who wrote a book on this kind of stuff, and he says, I'm not sure I buy it all the way down, but what he says is these kind of moments where you have this sort of experimental art like that is kind of like Adam naming the animals in the Genesis account, where he says this is now a thing with a name, right? This is so there's something about imparting the personal stamp on an impersonal object that he argues is kind of a beautiful moment. So I could maybe go that far, but no, I think there are obviously things in the world which are objectively ugly and destructive. But I also I wonder if the bigger danger to us is that we have dulled our senses so thoroughly that we're unable to be attuned to the beautiful things that don't present themselves immediately as beautiful, right? Like, are we paying enough attention, I guess is the question. Yeah. And so what I would say, like stepping a step further from Plato, who would talk about beauty as a form, I would make the identification of beauty and God and truth and God and goodness and God and the sort of as the source of these things. And so any of those transcendentals that I mentioned, the transcendentals are in a sort of a theological way. They are ways of naming God as being, right? This gets a little philosophical, but the transcendentals are called such, truth, goodness, beauty, because they transcend categories and they are thus interchangeable in in God, right? So that God is the source of all truth and all goodness and all beauty, and truth is goodness, is beauty, is truth, is goodness, is beauty, right? So it's not that beauty is prioritized in the kind of theological and philosophical conception of the transcendentals. It's that it's the one that nobody really in modern times really includes in that, right? Because you have all this sort of history of aesthetics that says beauty is just personal, it's just subjective. It's not one of those, which is why I'm like maybe overcompensating in that way. Yeah, good, thank you. I want to sort of stay away from like giving a formula for that, right? Because I do want to kind of stand by the claim that it is also the subjective experience of the perceiver who has, everybody comes to things that they see and experience in a way that's formed by their own culture and formed by their own sort of structure and history and bias and all those kinds of things. And so I think we do have to account for taste, right? Some people may really like the sort of classical art and find modern art off-putting. The easy thing to say is modern art is ugly and classical art is not, but I think that's a little bit lazy. I think it's important to be able to articulate what it is that makes something beautiful. But I feel like really reluctant to sort of say it's, the thing that's more proportionate or the thing that has more simplicity or fluidity, because there are always exceptions. So, I think it's a very difficult question that you're asking, a very good question, a very insightful question. To me, it would be less important to sort of make those fine judgments and really just kind of think about, does it open up your heart in this way, or is it something that that closes you off or makes you just buy something? You know what I mean? Like, does it make you a consumer or does it make you a creator? I guess is a kind of the more important adjudication in my mind. But that's something we can think more about together. That's really a good question. That's hard. Well, can I say the most recently beautiful thing? All right, I'll cheat. This I'm reading this book now. I was reading it yesterday on the plane, called The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. I don't know if anyone's ever read this book. It's a book that it sounds just awful on paper. It's this man kind of he just sort of looks at hawks. He follows hawks and he writes down this kind of like devastatingly beautiful prose about what he sees. and these descriptions, I mean, I was literally crying on the plane. I read a sentence and I was like, that is the world's most perfect sentence. You know, it was just like, so, you know, things like that. I guess I'm sort of more drawn to sort of literature and those kinds of things. So, so those few sentences, I think, that really got at the sort of fragility of everything. And the book is so beautiful, but it also presents with a kind of sense of loss or a sadness. You know, it's a really beautiful book, so I'd recommend it. Yes, okay, great question. The question is, do beautiful things have value in themselves, or do they only, like Plato, you know, Plato leaves everything behind, right? I mean, I think that's the limitation of the Platonic understanding of beauty, is that by the time you get to the forms, everything else is just, you leave it behind, it's gone, right? But yes, I absolutely think that beautiful things now, you know, they participate in the beauty of God, and they sort of reflect the beauty of God. And insofar as they, you know, human beings can create beautiful things, not the way that God creates out of nothing, right? But we can create as, and so yes, absolutely. I think they do point us to God, which is the clue. But yes, they have absolute value in, you know, in themselves, and not just as a sort of pointing function. Yeah, absolutely. Have you all read this, it's a really marvelous essay by Simone Weil called On the Love of School Studies, and on the right use of school studies and the love of God? If you've not read that, I would say start there, because what Simone Weil argues is that every time we do anything like sweat over an impossibly difficult calculus problem, and we give our whole selves and all of our attention to figuring out this calculus problem, even if we get it wrong, there's this sense in which we're training ourselves to attend to something. And she says that struggling over math problems is the kind of key. So she says it teaches you how to pray, and it teaches you how to look at another human being and say, what are you going through? It's a gorgeous piece, but you know, I think this sense of cultivating attention and cultivating receptivity, Eucharistic adoration, which is next on our list, I think, is another way, I think, of doing that, like of just letting yourself slow down and receive and behold beauty, but be beheld by beauty in a way, like if we think of Eucharistic adoration working that way. So, I mean, I would put your phone in a drawer, I guess, is a more kind of like concrete thing, because we tend, when we have those moments of silence, when we can practice attention and can practice sort of silence and receptivity, we don't like that feeling, so we start scrolling through Instagram. You know, so it's I think maybe start there, and then kind of think about, you know, other ways of, you know, you can listen to music you've never quite listened to. I mean, I could have some recommendations of specific things that I think help. Arvo Pärd's music, I can give you a link later. I don't know, just ways of being more kind of attentive to beauty as it is always shining around us, right? Even in hidden forms, veiled forms. So, I mean, probably the most intelligent thing I could say about that is, I mean, if we think about the sort of the original creation narrative, which is going to be around the time of the Babylonian exile. So you've got, you know, all the Israelites have been gone to Babylon, and they start kind of inheriting the Babylonian set of myths about creation and those kinds of things. I'm sure this is something a little different from what you're talking about, but we can see the sort of imprint of those Babylonian myths, which were on 7 tablets, called the Enuma Elish is the name of the myth, and it kind of gets mirrored in the first account in Genesis 1. And we can talk a little bit more about, you know, if you want to talk later, just face to face, I can give you some more detail about how those things get reflected in creation, which comes into the theories of creativity for sure.